like to share a tale.
All right.
Is a tale, I'm not going to tell you where it comes from. Some of you might recognize it, but I suspect many will not. You'll only, if I tell you the names of the characters, you're sure to catch on. So I'll start here. This is a story of a king. Now this king was chosen by the wisest man in the land. The people of this land had no king. And they looked around everywhere around them and they said, "We want a king. Everyone else has a king. Can't we have one too?" And the wise man said, "A king will tax you and take your best animals as his own. A king will take your sons from you and train them to be soldiers. A king will rule harshly over you and place his family in positions of power and privilege while you suffer. You don't need a king." But the people said, all around, everyone else has a king. We want a king too. So the wise man went and he consulted to decide how a king should be found. And he was given a vision of a young man. Now this man was not terribly bright. He was not terribly wise. But he seemed to be a good king because he was the tallest person in the entire realm.
So not John.
Not John. He was strong and mighty. He had a firm jaw, a square nose. Not like John. Sorry, John.
It had to be said. Harry was thinking it. Go.
Yeah. And so this very tall young man was taken from his home and made king. And he reigned surprisingly well with the guidance of the wise man and other advisors for a time. But he had to do battle with enemies who entered his land, and he would raise armies to do battle. And one of his soldiers grew to be so mighty that he started to attract attention away from the king. And so the people would write songs, and they would say, "The king has slain thousands, but his warrior has slain tens of thousands." And the king started to see that his servant was attracting far too much attention. And he started to fear for his throne, lest the people remove him and replace him with this popular young man. So although the young man had kept his oath to serve his king, the king drove him out into the hills. And this young man and a few of his friends took up residence, not as bandits. Even in their exile, they continued to ride out of the hills and wreak havoc upon the king's enemies. Never once did they turn against the oath that they had sworn. And so this young soldier became even more popular. He became a man of legend, like a Robin Hood. And so the king determined to be done with him. He raised a great army, and he went out onto the road into the hills. And there he searched night and day, unable to find this crafty young soldier who had come to know the hills so well that he could melt into them as if invisible. So the king's search was fruitless. But one night the king decided to make camp in a little valley. And at the top of the valley, unbeknownst to him, was the camp of his former friend, his servant. And his servant decided that it was time to put to rest their feud once and for all. He realized that the king had been placed in his power and that this was not a coincidence. And he knew what he had to do. He took not his great sword, but a small knife. He crept silently down the hills, snuck past the sentries, and went into the very pavilion in which the king was sleeping. He walked up to the king, creeping so noiselessly that the man did not awake. And he went up to his throat, and he took his royal robe in his hands, and lifting his knife, he sliced a small piece of the trim from the king's robe and went back up to his camp. The next day the king awoke, not even realizing that he had missed a piece of his clothing. And the young man rode out under a flag of truce and said, "Your Majesty, I must speak with you." And there, before the whole kingdom, all the men of the realm in the army, this young man said, "Your Majesty, I have something of yours." And then the king looked, and all the people saw what had happened. And the young man said, "Last night you were delivered into my power, and your life lay in my hands. But never would I forsake my vow to obey and protect you. And so now I show you that no matter what the situation, you will never come to harm through me. I am and always will be your faithful servant." And the king, moved partly by love and partly by shame, walked up to the young man and embraced him. And the man returned to his place of honor. And you might think this is where the story would end, but it is not. For you see, even though the king's servant forgave him, the people did not. They remembered the faithlessness of their ruler, and they remembered the faithfulness of his servant. And so in due time, the very thing that the king had aimed to prevent came to pass. He was overthrown, and he was replaced as king by his servant, despite all their efforts to the contrary. And so this is a lesson for not just for kings, but for each of us, that when we act in bad faith, when we do something which is wrong to another, they may forgive us, but their forgiveness does not change what we have done. It does not change what people see. And we must always remember that whether king or commoner, our actions are judged not just by those who see them, but by all. And so I share this tale with you, and I'll share now with you the names of these two kings. The king's name was Saul. His faithful servant was a man named David. And this story comes from the Bible, a good period source.
Thank you.